Hey everyone, this is my review of The Center Cannot Hold by Elyn Sachs. I had to read this book for one of my classes, and I'm going to share kind of my big insights and takeaways. So really what this book is about Professor Sachs' personal journey with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. It starts early on when she has her kind of childhood experiences that shape a little bit of her condition, although it's very clear that she doesn't experience a lot of the major symptoms of schizophrenia until later in life. And we start to see a very gradual onset, reaching to the point where she starts to actually begin college at Yale. And then we start to see a marked shift in how this condition begins to affect her. I think personally for me, reading this book was very eye-opening because for many of us, we will never really have a conversation with somebody who has schizophrenia or had it or know somebody who has it. So personally, I was very far removed from this. And she writes in such a way that you can kind of see her moment by moment thoughts, especially when she's having a kind of psychotic episode and undergoing a lot of psychosis, which is just pretty much seeing a lot of hallucinations, people who aren't there, a lot of different thoughts that she feels are not her own. And this leads her to struggle in a lot of different aspects. But I think the most impressive thing about this is a story of resilience in the sense that she's able to not only, finish her undergrad, she goes on to then go to law school. She does have to kind of pause for a moment because she has some kind of big struggles there, but she's eventually able to, become a tenured professor at USC's law school and be able to teach other people. So I think this really highlights how for each individual, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. She definitely used medication, but there was times when she tried to get off of it. There were times when it wasn't enough, and for majority of the time, she mentioned how the medication was helpful, but it wasn't the solution for her, and that she actually had to talk to somebody quite frequently to kind of talk out her thoughts and talk out her kind of intrusive thoughts that were part of her condition. And so I think that it's a very interesting book because it's just so intertwined with her personal life that you really get sucked into it and you kind of feel like you're there, which can be, good. It can be bad because sometimes it's good to, empathize with these people and understand them more. It's also kind of dangerous, I think, to overly, just be sucked into this a little bit too much because there's a lot of moments when she has suicidal ideations and she's very She never really was at the point where she desired to harm other people, but there were moments when she felt very out of control. And I think one particular theme that kept reoccurring and that she said was pretty common among other people with similar kind of conditions is the fact that they all want to get off of their medication. They all want to be this kind of independent, which makes a lot of sense in the sense even though their medication is helping them, there are some, major side effects. One of them being it'll develop kind of a tick or your mouth will twitch, and this will just be something you can't control over time, and it becomes very noticeable to other people and also makes you look in a sense you're quote unquote crazy. So these kind of side effects, as well as noticeable weight gain, things that just everyday people, nobody would want that, right? So it's very understandable for them to want to get off this medication, but she tries multiple times to get off of it. And each time, the longer she's off of it or the longer she, lowers her doses or just stops taking as much of her medication, the more she really experiences a physical kind of just descent into, I think, a very dark place, as she could describe. I think, really towards the end of the book, she gets into a point where she says she's going to try once and for all to just stop the medication. Because the idea is that when you're on medication, these patients can attest to the fact that you don't feel like yourself. Some part of you feels very subdued. You feel like you're weak because you need this as a crutch. And because this is not something where, you can heal from it, in the sense that you may be, and many people are lifelong dependent on this medication just to, perform just basic functions, basic tasks, or just to, enjoy a relatively quote unquote normal life. And she goes on and tries to, push off the medication. And the problem is, like, as soon as she clearly starts to deviate with her medication, then she starts to go down a very slippery slope of where now all of a sudden a lot of the delusions come back. And a lot of these delusions include questioning people that have cared for her a lot, and also questioning some of her most, trusted, like, kind of therapists or providers or clinicians who have been helping her with her medication for, we're talking about, 5+ years. So this is a very, very strong relationship. And each time these kind of episodes occur, she is unable to control herself, in the sense that she's not necessarily harmful to other people. And that's one big thing that the author makes a point about, is that a lot of people with schizophrenia actually don't harm others. They're more likely to harm themselves. However, their demeanor and their kind of, actions can make it seem like they are on the verge of harming people. But the institutional, kind of societal response to that can be very extreme, in the sense that so during her time in Europe, in like UK, it was much more favorable, in the sense that the, psychiatric hospitals were a lot more understanding, more caring. But when she came back to the US, they were extremely hard-lined. They were using restrainers, which means they're just tying her down on to a table. And while while one person she was talking to felt that was actually, useful, but they were obviously coming from an outside perspective. They felt like it was useful because they made the equivalent, kind of comparison of people with mental illnesses as almost not human, which I don't think is appropriate. Because you can see throughout this book that this illness does not define her, in the sense that it's not her 24/7. She is not always in some sort of psychotic episode. But it comes and goes, especially with the medication, especially with certain triggers like stress. Like, I think maybe something better would be to think about like panic attacks. You don't think about someone who has panic attacks as being completely defined by panic attacks, but you understand that certain triggers cause a panic attack to happen and may alter their behaviors for a certain amount of time. And as such, this, kind of, she doesn't have like, they described it as schizophrenia, but there was also a part of like psychosis in it. So it was a little more nuanced in that, but it comes and goes. And there are moments when it's very bad. There are also moments when she functions perfectly fine. In fact, she's very like above average, in the sense she's able to, do a lot of rigorous law analysis, teach extremely difficult courses, achieve tenure, which is really difficult, in the sense you have to publish a lot of papers. They have to be very good papers, and you have to have a career of doing so. So like all of these things, like show that there is, and she's mentioned it to herself, really the difference between being on a kind of, being on that razor's edge of being extremely successful, but also and finding those kind of insights, and then sometimes not, really performing, and having that other side being called possibly a mental condition. And there's a lot of, famous people who at the end of the day have had some mental issues. And in a sense, it is sometimes easier to come to certain conclusions when you have differences in thinking, and that allows for a lot of revolutionary insight that does shape the world. And that's definitely, a fact. So I think that it really is, a difference in thinking, and it shouldn't be viewed in like a very negative light. But the truth of the matter is that it's just, there's an enormous stigma around it. And I think that her being able to tell her story and her journey in this book, and name people as well, and name herself, and she talks about her kind of non-existent love life for a long time, and then eventually being able to find somebody, but then always feeling like she had to hide, and she had to put this front on, in the sense that she couldn't tell her friends, or she could only tell a few people of what like was really happening. Because when she went into a psychotic episode, she would just start, kind of saying a bunch of nonsensical words altogether, and then start seeing a lot of different, people or images or things that were going to hurt her. And so she became extremely distraught. And to an average normal person who's not seeing what she's seeing, it becomes very difficult to understand what's happening. And as such, a lot of people become afraid, and then they all want to, in the end, they want to help, but the only way they know to help is to hospitalize her. And the problem is, especially when she's now in the US, hospitalization, especially for those who are seen as mentally potentially unfit, can be very brutal, as she describes, in the sense that they they tied her down with like, these thick leather straps, and then they put a net over her. And she even mentioned that hundreds of people each year suffocate because this net is actually not, apparently, I guess, breathable. And then on top of that, they tighten the net and they pour all these like kind of different medications, and they kind of force you to take them, So I think that just because people act very differently than us, just because people, have and are struggling with a lot of things that is very difficult for the average person to understand, I think it's not correct to take this approach. Of course, you can't blame people for taking it, because in the end, fear comes from a lack of understanding. A lot of people fear sharks because they feel like their chances of being attacked are very high, when in reality, sharks don't actually attack that many people. So there's a lot of like misunderstanding and fear that can happen when, we don't really know somebody who has a condition like this. And as such, we want to, protect ourselves, which is perfectly reasonable. And I think that it's a very complicated issue, because there are a lot of great, people who have this kind of condition, and the condition definitely does not define them. But it's very hard for somebody who doesn't have context, when somebody's in the middle of a psychotic episode, to understand that, because it takes a lot of empathy. It takes a lot of kind of context that the average everyday person doesn't have. And that just leads to them kind of calling the police restraining them forcibly, and then forcing them to go to a hospital, where even sometimes the providers there don't quite understand what's going on. So I think this was really, the first book that I've ever read where it's focused a lot on not only mental health in general, but the perception of mental illness and how that's not necessarily the accurate representation. It definitely doesn't provide a lot of solutions. And I think there is a lot of, problems with the current systems of how we address these things. But it's also I would say, rather predictable thing that we have all these problems just because of the way we're approaching it. So that's my book review. If you have any other questions, put them down below. Otherwise, subscribe for more.